The grand chamber of the Galactic Assembly was not designed for comfort. It was designed for truth. High above a swirling galactic plane, suspended in orbit around a dead white star, the chamber resembled a cathedral of geometry. Massive triangular columns of obsidian alloy, luminous strands of bioreactive light weaving through vaulted arches. The delegates arrived in silence, each escorted by their own customs, their own traditions, their own shadows of history. The air was thick with the tension of unsaid things. There was no music, no ceremonial speech this time, no introduction, because the topic had already introduced itself: humanity. They were new by galactic standards, barely a century since their admittance into the assembly. But in that time, they had unsettled everything. Some feared them, others admired them. A few simply didn't understand them, but none ignored them. From the elder-born races that had watched stars live and die, to the crystalline thinkers of the cold space clouds, all had gathered for one purpose: to address what had been whispered behind closed doors for decades. What is the true cost of allowing humans into the galactic fold? The question was not rhetorical. It was the crack beneath the floor, the whisper behind every diplomatic smile. And now, it had risen to the surface. On the central dais, a circle of light pulsed to life, an open floor for grievances, testimony, and warnings. An elder of the Vulcans stepped forward first, their 6 eyes blinking in asynchrony, voice translating through a harmonic modulator. We do not raise this discussion in hatred. We raise it in caution. There are anomalies in this species, patterns we have not seen in eons. They adapt too fast. They grieve, yet grow stronger. They burn, yet become brighter. Every time we believe we understand them, they evolve again. Silence followed. Not because there was disagreement, but because there were others who had said similar things, in private. Now, they could no longer pretend to be silent observers. One by one, the voices began to rise. Some cold, some passionate, some merely curious, but all revolving around a single truth none could dismiss. Humanity was unlike anything the galaxy had ever invited in. And now, it was too late to turn them away. The assembly began. The first voice, to follow the prologue's silence, came from the Tavari conclave, a species of intellectual collectivists whose civilization stretched across 8 systems, each ruled by a council of reason. Ambassador Thal-Vex stepped forward, tall and insectile, his exoskeletal plating etched with ceremonial ridges. "They are chaos with skin," he said plainly. A ripple of murmurs followed. "You admire their innovation," he continued, "but ignore the cost of that creativity. Every advancement they've made was born from fire, war, desperation, rivalry. They achieved brilliance, not through peace, but through friction. And friction, delegates, does not fade, it spreads." The Tavari had once opened trade routes to humanity. 2 decades later, they closed them, citing cultural incompatibility and an alarming rise in unauthorized reverse engineering of Tavari biotech. Delvex bowed slightly. They do not mean to break the rules, but they will. Because for them, rules are merely obstacles to be reinterpreted. A second voice soon followed, from the Urari Syndicate, a reclusive aquatic species known for their genetic precision and long memory. Their speaker was more reserved, more calculating. "We do not fear humans for their weapons," said Emissary Zakar, voice filtered through water-laced rebreathers. "We fear them for their persistence." He tapped a clawed digit against the data node, projecting historical timelines. One chart pulsed into view, a conflict on Syndral-1V, where a single human colony had resisted orbital bombardment, ecological collapse, and biological sabotage for 16 planetary rotations before finally evacuating on jury-rigged escape craft, built from scrap metal and melted drone casings. "No species should endure that," Zakar said quietly. And yet they did, and they did not speak of defeat. They called it a test. The silence returned, heavier now. Then came the Corali Elder voice, a massive being composed of luminous fiber strands, woven into a floating lattice. They were known as philosophers and watchers. Rarely did they speak in accusation, but even they seemed cautious. "You marvel at their emotion," the elder voice intoned, "at their ability to rage, to weep, to love and forgive within the same breath. But you do not consider what such duality can become when pointed outward. The chamber darkened slightly as the elder voice projected visual records. Footage of human wars, their monuments to fallen soldiers, their simultaneous capacity for horror and hope. They do not simply endure pain, the voice said. They refine it. They forge identity through suffering. That is not resilience, it is alchemy of the spirit. And it makes them unpredictable beyond calculation. A murmur moved through the room again. Less dismissal now, more unease. Another delegate stood. A tall, spindly representative from the Veltri chorus, their speech translated through harmonic modulation. We attempted a social exchange program, they said. 100 humans placed in our learning enclaves. Within 3 cycles, they reorganized our training systems, rewrote internal hierarchies, and introduced competitive practices we had not used in 1,000 years. A pause. And the frightening part, delegates, is that our youth flourished under it. Laughter rippled nervously through some of the chambers, but others didn't laugh. Because it was true. Humans didn't just change cultures by force, they changed them by being present. And once that influence began, it was rarely reversed. Then, finally, from the darker tier of the amphitheater, a delegate stood slowly, an old, scarred creature of stone and steel. General Krast of the Farnax hegemony, whose people had fought humans in the border conflicts. He didn't approach the podium. He simply spoke from where he stood. I once commanded a siege battalion on Veleth Prime. We held a city under orbital lockdown for 20 days. The human defenders numbered less than 200. They should have broken on the 3rd day. A pause. They made jokes, instead. No one interrupted him. They sang songs in the trenches. They painted crude symbols on their armor. They set traps that killed dozens of my soldiers, using only debris and sheer audacity. Another pause. The room was dead still now. We won that battle. But my soldiers, those that survived, still wake up screaming when they hear human music. Krast looked toward the center of the chamber. You ask why we fear them? Because there is no surrender in them. Only strategy, and stories, and fire. He sat down again, and for a while, no one spoke. Because fear, once spoken aloud, becomes harder to deny. The silence left behind by General Krast lingered like smoke. Heavy, unspoken, raw. But it did not last. From the far eastern arc of the chamber, a voice rose, measured, calm, but laced with conviction. Ambassador Shelley of the Yethari Coalition, a race of crystalline sentients known for their strategic neutrality, took the floor. Her form glistened beneath the light lattice, facets of her translucent body shifting color with her emotions, now a deep, serene amber. Yes, she said, humans burn, but fire is not only destruction. Fire is also light, fire is warmth, fire is how civilizations survived their first night. There was a subtle hum of dissent, but Shelley pressed forward. I stood among human engineers after a reactor breach on Kelvor Station. Everyone else had evacuated. They stayed, not for profit, not for glory. They said, if we don't fix it, someone else dies. No ceremony, no obligation, just choice. She paused, letting the words settle. So many of you speak of fear, but I have seen what humanity does when fear should rule them. They act instead. And sometimes, that's what the galaxy needs. A moment later, another figure rose, smaller, wrapped in dark feathers and adorned in ceremonial talismans. High Listener Valk of the Avanari Dream Communion, a species long suspected of limited precognition, bowed respectfully. We have walked their minds, Valk said softly, wings folding. We have seen the duality. Their darkness, yes, but also their dreams. The feathers shimmered faintly. Do you know what they dream of, even after war, even after death? The chamber remained silent. They dream of building, of finding new songs, of standing where no one else has stood. Not to conquer, but to look, to understand. That is not monstrous, that is beautiful. A few murmurs of agreement echoed now, small but growing. Then came a voice far older than the rest. The ancient Jainari custodian, whose race had existed before many species had language. Their presence was rare, their speeches rarer still. In every galactic cycle, the custodian began. A species emerges that does not follow pattern, that breaks convention, not from arrogance, but from an inability to be still. Humanity is that anomaly. They tilted their heads slowly, eyes like frozen starlight. But anomalies are not always dangers. Sometimes they are necessary recalibrations. Sometimes evolution wears a different face. The most surprising supporter, however, came next. From the shadowed row of minor council seats, a representative stood, a sleek, silver-scaled being with slit pupilled eyes. Envoy Skirn of the Murnax Compact, a species who had once skirmished with humans over mining territories. A species who had once called humans reckless primates with tools. "We feared them," Skirn said plainly. "Still do." A few heads turned in confusion. "But we've also learned from them. We adapted, evolved our trade practices. We've seen profits rise, innovations multiply, entire industries born from hybrid designs. And now, our youth study Earth history like holy scripture." He smirked, a sharp expression alien in nature, but oddly human in tone. "Fear? Perhaps. But fear can be a beginning, not an end." One final voice rose, this time, not a politician, not an ambassador, but a civilian representative. Lyra Menken, human, appointed by assembly vote to offer Earth's voice without political pretense. She stood quietly for a moment, before speaking. "You fear what we could be," she said. "But have you considered what we want to be?" No one interrupted her. "You see our wars, our fire, our noise, but do you see our art? Our healing? Our stories, passed down not for control, but for memory? Have you read our poems, written in bomb shelters? Or the lullabies mothers sang while waiting under orbital sieges?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "We're not perfect, we're not safe, but we've come here not to conquer, but to contribute, to learn, to share." She glanced around the chamber. "And yes, to challenge old systems, because maybe some of them need to be challenged." Her final words echoed long after she sat down. "We're not what you fear. Not yet. But we might be what you need." The chamber was still again. Not convinced, not unified, but uncertain. And in a galaxy where certainty ruled for millennia, uncertainty carried more weight than any weapon. Not all voices in the galaxy came from seats of power. Some emerged from the fringes, scientists, historians, wanderers, watchers. The ones who didn't speak in policy or protocol, but in curiosity, in caution, in quiet fascination. Their words didn't ripple through assembly halls. They echoed in lecture chambers, field reports, barroom conversations, and confidential memos never meant for transmission. And yet, they mattered, because they watched what others overlooked. And they understood what others feared to say aloud. The researcher's log. Dr. Kel Una of the Valan Archive Collective, a sociocultural xenologist, had spent 3 decades cataloging emergent species development. Her latest log entry, never formally published, was circulated quietly among peer networks. There's a misconception in the scientific community that humans are primitive due to their age. This is false. What they lack in temporal tenure, they make up for in adaptive velocity. The cultural mutation rate of humanity rivals, perhaps exceeds, any previously recorded civilization. She paused in her dictation. They do not perfect systems. They challenge them, disassemble, rebuild, fail, rebuild again, differently. Where most species refine a process over centuries, humans iterate in decades. It's not intelligence alone. It's restlessness, a refusal to accept limits. The same trait that builds hospitals also builds weapons. The same spirit that explores stars also triggers rebellions. Her closing lines read like a warning, wrapped in awe. They are not inherently violent. They are inherently unwilling to stop moving. The day that motion aligns with a singular purpose, the galaxy will change. The Merchant's Report. Vel Ora, a traveling trade liaison from the wandering Votari fleets, shared her experience at a private economic summit. "I've bartered across 14 systems. You know who makes the best negotiators? Humans, not because they manipulate, but because they understand value beyond currency. They'll trade food for stories, spare parts for music, help you repair your engine, and ask nothing in return. but to hear how your people farm ice on comet rings. She had paused, claws tapping against her glass. And if you cross them, if you lie or cheat, they remember. Not with vengeance, but intention. They'll show up in the next cycle with a better trade hub, better prices, and partners who trust them more than they trust you. That's how humans win. Not just in battle, but in connection. The soldiers whisper. There's a story passed around, low security corridors. No author, no signature, just a report. Redacted, unverified, but believed. Unit encountered unknown human team during surface recon op. Hostile terrain, zero support, our squad was compromised. We expected evacuation delays. Human team shared rations, repaired comms array, and guided us to exfil point without being asked. They left before we could thank them. Only trace was a burned sigil on a rock wall. We don't leave people behind. None of this was in their orders. The report ended with a single line scribbled by hand. They weren't heroes, they were just human. The Scholar's Theory. Professor L. Firin, a respected theorist from the Erythraean Deep Library, posed a controversial hypothesis in her lecture series. Humanity is not dangerous because of what it is now, but because of what it could become with time. Imagine a species that evolves faster than our models can predict, whose art forms shift within a generation, whose ethics recalibrate with each war, yet somehow persist. She stared across her audience. What happens when such a species outgrows, not just their world, but their fears, their boundaries, their mortality? Will they become monsters, saviors, or something entirely new? Not every outsider feared humanity, but none ignored it. Not anymore. The official statements had ended, the delegates had spoken, the observers had theorized. But beneath the polished veneer of protocols and diplomatic handshakes, in the sealed corridors of military think tanks and private information networks, a different kind of conversation was unfolding. Because some things were not spoken openly. Some things were only whispered. Classified transmission, level 6 eyes only, unverified threat assessment. We intercepted an encrypted human transmission, routed through non-standard relays. At first glance, it appeared to be a training simulation archive. Tactical maneuvers, adaptive threat modeling, AI-assisted war scenarios. But after deeper analysis, we believe it was something else. Quote, the file was a self-generating war doctrine. It rewrites itself based on potential enemy capabilities, reshaping entire theaters of conflict within seconds. No species we know deploys this type of cognitive weapon design. It thinks like them, fast, messy, purposeful. One subroutine was labeled Victory Through Chaos. Another, Failure Modeling for Triumph Rebound. We don't know what those mean, but we suspect it's a doctrine to weaponize their own defeats. The report ends with a note scrawled in human script. Every loss is a lesson. Every scar, a tactic. Confiscated audio clip, Incident 19A, Outer Colony Delta. Background static. Then, a low raspy voice, human, male. Tired. They came thinking we were weak, that we were scattered. But we weren't. You know the thing about us, right? We get tired. We fall. But we never stay down. We crawl back. You beat us once, we learn. You beat us twice, we change. You keep coming, and eventually, you'll wish we hadn't survived the first time. End transmission. Unconfirmed. No visual evidence. But the recording circulates in black channels like a ghost story. Human duality is not a contradiction, it is a pattern. Their most compassionate medics have trained as snipers. Their poets have fought in trenches. Their spiritual leaders study weapons engineering. Unquote. It is as if they were never meant to be one thing, but everything at once. Builder and destroyer, guardian and threat. What they cannot conquer, they adapt to. What they cannot understand, they name, then redefine. Final note. Do not assume their kindness is weakness. It may simply be a choice they are free to stop making. On the edge of explored space, in forgotten mining outposts and derelict colonies, rumors whisper through airlock doors. A lone human ship appearing after a distress signal. Too late to save the colony, but not too late to avenge it. An alien slaver fleet, ambushed by a vessel thought to be a freighter. Its hull scarred, its armaments makeshift. It destroyed 3 cruisers before disappearing into asteroid fields. No records, no identifiers, just stories. They weren't soldiers, one witness claimed. They were farmers, mechanics, parents, and somehow they still won. And always, at the end of every story, you don't provoke humans unless you're prepared to deal with the ones they become afterward. Even among the psychic species, those who communicate in thought and feeling, something has shifted. A dream reader from the Trinari core reported a new presence in the galactic subconscious. A rising storm, not malevolent, but immense, like a tide of potential energy held back only by choice. It dreams of unity, but it carries war in its bones. It longs for peace, but its hands remember fire. It is not evil, it is not noble. It is simply becoming. And no one knows what it will become next. The assembly adjourned with no resolution. There were no sanctions, no declarations, no votes cast. Because how do you vote on a feeling? How do you legislate the whisper that lingers behind your thoughts at night? The quiet realization that a force has entered your world that you cannot predict. The final minutes of the session were procedural, records sealed. Delegates filed out beneath vaulted spires of light, their expressions unreadable. Some avoided eye contact. Some walked faster than usual. A few lingered, deep in private thought. And humanity's seat remained empty, not by absence, but by choice. No rebuttal, no defense, no speech. They had been invited to speak. They had declined. Let them talk, Earth's representative had said beforehand. Let them see us through their own eyes, before we show them ours. And so they did. In quiet corners of the galaxy, the discussion continued. Some argued for stricter monitoring. Others proposed closer alliances. A few, not many, but a few, began to prepare for the worst. Fleet budgets quietly increased. Surveillance of human colonies doubled. Diplomatic outreach teams were reshuffled under the guise of cultural exchange. And yet, there were others who reached out, not in fear, but in hope. Species who sent students to Earth, who invited human thinkers into their councils, who believed that the best way to meet potential is to shape it together. The galaxy had not made up its mind, because the truth was still forming. In a bar on a neutral station orbiting a blue dwarf star, two beings sat in silence. One, a scholar from the Yalsari monastic order, all silver feathers and gentle thoughts. The other, a grizzled old freighter pilot, human, sipping something amber from a steel cup. The Yalsari finally spoke. They're still debating you, you know. In the assembly. The human didn't look up. Let him. Some fear you, others praise you. The pilot chuckled. That tracks. But which is true? The Yalsari asked. Are you saviors, or something more dangerous? The human raised his glass, eyes heavy with time and stories no one would believe. We're both, he said. Depends on what you give us a reason to be. They clinked glasses in the silence that followed. In the end, there was no final verdict. No declaration carved into law, just a growing understanding that something had changed in the fabric of the galaxy, and it bore the shape of a species whose history was measured in war and poetry, invention and chaos, compassion and wrath. A species that looked up at the stars, not with reverence, but with intent. And somewhere, far beyond the assembly, beyond the councils and scholars and war rooms, humanity was still moving forward. Still learning. Still becoming. And no one, no matter how wise or ancient, could say what would come next. Not yet.